Chapter 21 The Intoxicator. As an enchantress, Ishtar tempted, allured, and captivated. She caused her followers to abandon reason and rationality, to do what they otherwise would never have done. She cast spells. She worked magic. Thus her ability to seduce was all the more potent. Ishtar's potion. As the goddess who dwelled in taverns, Ishtar was strongly connected to the substances of intoxication served and partaken of there. In one of her myths, the schemes to take away the powers and blueprints of civilization contained in the tablets of the god Enki. She partakes with him of alcoholic beverages until he becomes intoxicated, at which point she takes off with the tablets. So to Ishtar belong the powers of both seduction and intoxication. Thus it is of note that at the same time that the sexual revolution was taking hold of America, a parallel movement began, an explosion in the usage of intoxicating substances. After holding steady from the end of the Second World War, the rate of American alcohol consumption suddenly began rising. The escalation would continue for 2 decades and then would be followed by another escalation that would continue into the 21st century. The mind alterer. But it was another form of intoxication that so dramatically exploded in American and Western culture that it would in part define the 1960s, that of drugs. The phenomenon became so widespread that it gave birth to its own culture, the drug culture. Among the most celebrated of the newly embraced intoxicating substances were psychedelic or mind-altering drugs that radically altered perception, thinking, and behavior. The state of intoxication and altered consciousness was now glorified as an ideal to be sought after. It was all in keeping with the goddess's nature. It was her power and will to alter consciousness, perception, and reality. With or without intoxicating substances, she was altering the American consciousness. Sex, drugs, rock, and Ishtar. For the ancient Mesopotamian, the taverns were inhabited by the spirit of Ishtar. It was there that those affected by her allurements were surrounded by 3 elements: sexuality, intoxicating substances, and music. When the spirit of Ishtar manifested in American culture in the 1960s, 2 of the 3 elements also manifested: sexuality and intoxicating substances. The third component would converge as well: music. Each of the 3 would epitomize the decade that began the transformation of American culture. In 1969, a Life magazine article identified the 3 elements as the counterculture's new sacraments: sex, drugs, and rock, or sexuality, intoxicating substances, and music, the 3 elements that characterized Ishtar's dwelling place. Medium of the gods. The Mesopotamians especially sought the power of Ishtar in performing magic and enchantments on those in their lives. She was the goddess of spells. Her powers were called upon to redirect or inflame a person's sexual desire or romantic affection. The spell could involve rituals, the use of objects, apples, pomegranates, the weaving together of cords into knots, symbolic acts that today would be called sympathetic magic or witchcraft. Ishtar was the goddess of mediums, those who were said to be possessed of the spirits. They spoke for the gods and revealed supernatural knowledge and counsel. Her spirit possessed them, as it did her prophets. Ishtar herself was a medium, the mediator between the gods and mortals. Today, such mediums would also be known as fortune tellers, psychics, channelers, and practitioners of the occult. Indeed, all these elements associated with the goddess would today be categorized under the heading of the occult. She was the occult goddess. The occult revival. Thus we might expect that with the return of Ishtar to the modern world, there would be a revival in the occult. And that again is exactly what happened. It was no accident that the same decade that witnessed America's turning from God, the beginning of the sexual revolution, the overturning of gender, the weakening of family, and the wide dissemination of mind-altering substances also witnesses a massive revival into the occult. The spiritual void left in God's absence drew millions into a dark spirituality, and as with other movements launched by the gods, occult beliefs and practices moved from the fringes and shadows of society to its mainstream. Witches and goddesses. Out of the occult revival came an explosion in the practice of witchcraft as well as in the number of women identifying as witches. In this they were taking on the attributes of the goddess. The occult revival would also give birth to the revival of pagan worship, neo-pagan movements and hybrid movements that merged the occult with Eastern religion and ancient paganism. It would also produce movements, organizations and religions dedicated to Satan worship. There was one other movement of special note that would also spring up from the seeds planted in the late 20th century occult revival, goddess worship. It was an outgrowth of the neo-pagan movements born of that revival. It included the worship of mother goddesses, nature goddesses, warrior goddesses, and great goddesses, among others, often included in the pantheon of goddesses to be venerated or worshipped as the goddess in her varied incarnations of Astarte, Aphrodite, Venus, Inanna, and of course, Ishtar. The Grand Enchantment. The revival of goddess worship was also an outgrowth of the feminist revival that happened simultaneously to the occult revival. Both were linked to Ishtar. Now the two converged, but it was all converging. The sexual revolution with feminism, feminism with the occult with intoxicating revolution. With intoxicating substances. Intoxicating substances with music, and music with the sexual revolution. In the goddess, they were all joined together. They were all joined together as well in that they were part of the paganization of America and the re-paganization of Western civilization. As we have seen, the new morality was a revival of pagan morality. The occult and New Age beliefs were a revival of pagan rituals and religious practices, and the sexual revolution was a reviving of pagan sexuality. The gods were succeeding in transforming a Christian civilization into a pagan one. Transformation was Ishtar's speciality. She could enchant and seduce a nation, intoxicate it, alter its perceptions, and thus change its ways, entrance it and possess it. What began taking hold of American and Western civilization in the 1960s would continue unfolding, developing and advancing long after the decade had come to an end. But there was still one more player in the Dark Trinity, It could be argued that this was the darkest of the three. It is to that spirit and mystery that we go now, the third of the Dark Trinity, that of the Destroyer.